So again, the subject of the lecture today is what a tantric learns from Jesus. And for some of us in this world it is Easter today, not for the Orthodox Church but for the Catholic and Evangelist churches it is. And it is the celebration of the resurrection of Christ, but also, of course, the memory, the awareness of his suffering on the cross, which even when I say this, probably some of you get goosebumps, not necessarily because you're so touched and filled with aspiration, but because you might find some of these religious beliefs sort of appalling and connected to a whole lot of maybe traditional viewpoints that don't align so much with you, especially if you are a spiritual seeker that has already maybe understood that there is, or let's say the concept of a God as some figure sitting somewhere with a long beard on a cloud is maybe not anymore what you vibrate with, but might somehow be correlated to these Christian values that we have very deeply engraved within our Western culture without them necessarily being very consciously digested and applied. So within this lecture today, I want to talk a little bit about this figure of Jesus and also this particular state of consciousness that he has reached, the Christ consciousness. Yeah, I don't necessarily expect all of you to be massive Jesus fans. I know some of you are, so good for you. You will enjoy this lecture and all its different nuances. For the others, you might have to chew your way through it in some parts, but let's see where we're going with all this. So first things first, what is maybe important to understand how I'm talking about Jesus within this context here is somehow Jesus as a master. The figure, the historical figure of Jesus, and I know there are debates whether or not that historic figure actually existed, but if we just take the stories as they are, one thing that we can conclude is, for sure, Jesus was a master of his particular, let's say, spiritual approach and living that to the fullest, going in accordance with his words. And one thing that probably you might have noticed is that in nowadays spirituality, some of it so-called spirituality, but in general we are not necessarily so open, especially in the West, to the concept of a master, to the idea that there is some sort of guy who did it all and who has it all right and who can now guide us through. And obviously, as we would be vulnerable to such a person in quite a large degree, might take all sorts of advantage of our sort of position. Therefore, in the West, we have sort of a little bit declined towards a spirituality that is very self-centered, a spirituality that is all about my little private thing, my little private relationship that I have with the universe and with the divine, if I even allowed to call it so, and just be still and just be present, and everything else will fall into place, which in itself, those are beautiful ideas. But as we will see throughout this lecture, and also if you are attempting to become, let's say, an adept of the tantric path, you will see that somehow that is not enough with the current state of evolution that we have on this planet and that most of us find ourselves at. It is sort of not enough to just say, just be still, become present, and you'll be fine, which in itself is correct, but for most of us is basically an impossibility. So there is this wish to somehow don't involve other people, don't involve greater entities into our little spiritual seeking, but rather have the God within, have the stillness within, have everything here with myself. I buy myself some books, I do some workshops, and boom, I'm on my spiritual path and things are great. But those of you who have studied already with us and have maybe put yourself a little bit more deeply into the study of the spiritual path, and especially the practice of the spiritual path, you have already noticed that you do need people. You do need people to guide you and to give you some perspective sometimes, to help you through difficult times, to help you mirror yourself so that you don't just get stuck on your own little story forever and ever and not move on through it within this life. And the ultimate person to reflect you in that way would be the master. And this is a concept that on the tantric path is extremely clear and very valid and very defined. I'm aware that in the neo-tantra realm of things, not necessarily has this idea arrived from the traditional tantra. But nevertheless, if you are studying, for example, the very famous Kagyu lineages of Tantra, which are the lineages that bring out the current Karmapa, you might know the Dalai Lama and the Karmapa, and the Karmapa lineage is the Kagyu lineage. Some of the great names from that lineage are Milarepa and Marpa, Tilopa and Naropa. And all of these are known to have a master, and some of them not just one, but actually several, and check in with them and understanding how to navigate the path and how to move through the trials of this tantric path, which is known to be the shortest but also the most dangerous path, as it somehow has intrinsically as a definition within it that you would reach liberation within this one life. So the idea of Jesus being a master for the tantric is not very complicated, but is actually very helpful. It's an idea that the tantric is even seeking for, always seeking for those teachers, those models, divine models around that will allow us to, let's say, continuously align ourselves towards, to let that continuous transformation that Tantra is all about be guided into that direction of that model of the master. The universe keeps sprinkling masters all over the place. In some cases, even you might have known or you might have heard of this phenomena of the avatars, godly aspects that are born into a person. For example, the great Ramakrishna, one of the great saints of the last century, and a great bhakti and also considered tantric, he said at the end of his life, when he was close to his death, that that which is Rama is in me, and that which is Krishna, that is also within me, clearly therefore revealing himself as an avatar of the godly attribute, of these two godly attributes, is not correct, godly aspects. Also maybe you've heard of the great Babaji, who's considered an avatar as well, or the great Krishna, who was an avatar of the god Vishnu. So this is, within the Hindu context, quite known that there are aspects of the divine that find their way into an incarnation and then guide people into liberation, into the spiritual path. Jesus is considered exactly such an avatar. Some people believe that he has been an avatar of God the Father, as we call it in the Christian realm, or you could say the Paramashiva, or that Godhead, the highest neutral, the Brahman, you could say, manifested into the flesh through Jesus Christ. Now, when these avatars and saints and masters appear on this planet, usually the first thing that happens is society feels itself a little bit threatened in its general rigidity and its general wish to create a certain rigid order, a certain not necessarily following the godly order, but a specific order that is supposedly held in place for the good of everyone, but also nails us and pins us down into a certain limited level of consciousness. If you look at one society, you can usually quite easily feel what level that society is on. If you see a society that is very much centered around monetistic aspects, around consumerism, around safety, security, it is very easy to say that this society is manifesting mainly at the levels of Muladhara and Svadhisthana chakra, the first two chakras of our being. If you would see, let's take something fictional, if you would see like the elves from the Lord of the Rings, who are all about the wisdom and integrity and virtue and so forth, it is likely to assume that with that particular refinement and dignity, they have probably a common awakening of the higher levels of the being. So as a society, you lock yourself into a specific place, which, if that is threatened by someone who's just completely free, like a saint, like an avatar, that society will obviously react to that being. And if you consider how society reacted to wonderful free beings like Yogananda and like Ramakrishna, which anyways have also been living in a society that is much more embracing to the concept of a master, a guru. But even they have been prosecuted, and especially when Yogananda came to the US, it became quite severe for him, his situation. And we've known stories of many masters that during their times have been prosecuted in one way or another, and only later have been known as the great saints of their time. If you think to what degree this happened to Jesus Christ, you might consider as a consequence, okay, very likely something is really up with this guy. If his message, the goodness that he was spreading throughout his life, was met with such a disdain, with such a cruelty, with such a severity in not just putting someone on trial, not just locking them away for life, but having such a feast of cruelty unleashed on one single person that was simply preaching about compassion and about following the path of the heart, you might want to consider them at least interesting for your study. So no matter what relationship you currently have with Jesus, I definitely invite you to study his life and to, if you have a tantric curiosity, to come from this viewpoint of understanding what a huge legacy this person left behind. If you think that supposedly he died some 2,000 years ago, something in that direction, and even though not precisely following his example, but still from that little Jewish sect that he originally had, we have now a world religion. We have people that, sure, they might not always be the smartest and the most enlightened, but still live by an idea of loving their neighbor, live to, at least to a certain degree, with a wish of aligning with that message of Jesus 2,000 years later. This is quite an impressive result to have with one short little human life of just barely a little over 30 years old. So this being said, we can observe that the life and the particular, let's say, effects of the actions of Jesus Christ carry a very specific signature to them that reminds very much of some of the big principles and, like, let's say, basic ground pillars of the tantric practice. So let's look into these a little bit more. One thing that sort of stands out when you study how Jesus is related to, Jesus Christ, better to say, is related to nowadays, is obviously the followers of Christianity. They are, most of them, not all of them, relatively big fans of the Christ and put him on the altar and enjoy him and have the little cross on their mountains and on their bedroom walls, of course, so you don't do naughty things when you're not supposed to, etc., etc. But interestingly, when you go to India and you look at some of the altars there, you will find that next to Kali having her tongue enrolled all over the place, and Shiva with and with a big halo of radiance dancing the cosmic dance of life, and Ganesha with a elephant head and a human body, and all these sort of interesting gods. There you find a little picture of Jesus, a little cross, a little arrangement like that, and in the good Indian style, a bunch of rose petals thrown on top and some incense sticks, and somebody's ringing the bell for Jesus every morning. And this interesting transition, is that a word? Transition? Of a religious character that is very clearly assigned to one religion into other religions, into other belief systems. This is quite peculiar, that is a thing with Jesus Christ. Obviously, for the Muslims, now Jesus is not a figure that they put onto their altar, not at all. But at least he's not considered like a complete crazy person who made another religion, which for sure we have to be against, but is rather considered, okay, yeah, he was a prophet, at least that. So interestingly, there is a certain opening, a certain unification that the message of Jesus brings that resonates with, interestingly, a whole lot of religions. I had a talk here in Thailand with a contractor that helped us build Amrita Ashram here that we are currently dwelling at. And I asked him a little bit on how's the whole religious situation here in Thailand. Obviously, Thailand is the one official Buddhist country within this world, like that has as an official religion, Buddhist religion. But there are relatively big groups of Christians and Muslims as well, especially Muslims in the south and Christians in the north. And somehow his conclusion was that there are some tensions with the Muslim population, and there were also at one point some bombings and these sort of very unfortunate events. So he was like, yeah, that's not maybe necessarily the easiest relationship between the two groups, but you know how, if you were ever here, Thai people are, they are very kind, and even if things are difficult, they will not use a bad word against another group of religious belief. But then he said, with the Christians it's absolutely no problem. And I said, I wonder why that is. And he looked at me as if because I'm sitting there, supposedly the spiritual teacher, him, the contractor, and he's like, it's a very easy equation, because we have the Buddha, is a dude who sat down, got enlightened, and then guided other people to enlightenment. You have this other guy, Jesus, who sat down and got enlightened, and then guided other people to enlightenment. It's pretty obvious somehow, it's the same thing. So there is in general this unified reality around Christ that even goes to a very interestingly high degree. There's a bunch of especially Indian saints that have been even achieving enlightenment through the message of Christ. Probably the most well-known is Ramakrishna, who by prayer and by relating to this Christ consciousness would continuously enter into samadhi and eventually even into liberation, therefore revealing this entire path of Christianity as one of the paths of enlightenment. He did that with several religions and belief systems, one of the great legacies of Ramakrishna. His student Vivekananda called Jesus one of the greatest men in history, and Yogananda, who you might know from his biography of a yogi, even wrote a compiled book of very interesting viewpoints of how yoga and Jesus' message relates. It's called the Yoga of Jesus. And he advised his disciples to pray like this: God, Christ, Gurus, and then to put your prayer. It's very interesting that he would formulate it, him, an Indian, would formulate it in this way: God, and then Christ, and then all the other gurus. It's a very interesting sort of complete like movement into another stream of religion, if you will. For the yogis in this context, Jesus became, especially in India, a very interesting character because his life is sort of a model yogi life, if you think about it. the values that Jesus brought forth of compassion, of discipline as well, of having courage, of aiming to unify with God, becoming like God, shaping yourself in a way that allows you to manifest the godly attributes, all the different, let's say, characteristics that allow us to unite with God. An exemplary courage, an exemplary compassion, an exemplary empathy, an exemplary capacity to detach, an exemplary love, an exemplary grace, and so forth. He was manifesting so many of these godly attributes that make him so interesting for the yogi disciple, who can directly take the model of Jesus as a model to align, as we said in the beginning, your entire transformation towards. Now, within Jesus' legacy, you find a whole lot of different aspects that you could pick up and consider as great yogic values. I mentioned already many of them, like compassion, love, devotion, self-giving, courage, and so forth. But I wanted to pick out for tonight just 3 main points, and there are many more, that sort of are very interesting to contemplate and to become aware as even an encrypted lesson for you as a tantric practitioner. Hey guys, if you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more content on spirituality, tantra, and more.
And if you want to sign up for our online classes or for our retreats, you can see our website on the description below.